That's very clear. All right.
Fabíola is also joining.
Yep. Hi, Professor Zibetti. Can you hear us and can you see us?
Hi, Philip. Hi, Kim. Hello, Axel. How are
Hello,
you?
nice to meet you.
Nice
Hi.
to meet you too.
So I'm just, for the moment, troubleshooting a little bit on my part because for some reason I can't see anybody. But I have it on good authority that everybody else can see each other, which is good.
Yes.
Let's see. Well, okay. Okay, so now I can see everybody. Not sure what's changed, but okay. So just to make sure, we have 1 or 2 minutes left before we start. So the idea is, as we discussed, that we have about 10 to 15 minutes for everybody for presenting. We have a slightly, different order than in the email invitation. I think it makes most sense for Axel to start first to set the theme and discuss some issues or introduce some issues that can then be further touched upon by the other speakers. Then I have suggested Professor Kim to be the second speaker, and then finally Professor Zibetti to close off. And we have the 3 presentations back to back, I suggest, and then we can collect some questions from the audience and have a Q&A at the very end, also just to make sure that every speaker has enough time, and then we can collect questions and have kind of overarching discussion. Is that okay for everybody?
Yeah.
Okay,
Sounds
great.
good.
And everybody should be able to share their screen as well. If you have any PowerPoint or other visual tools, then that should be not a problem. So it's almost time to start, but I suggest that we wait for a couple of more minutes just to allow people to join. As I said, we have 80 registrations, but let's say we're hoping for about, let's say 30, 40 people from the audience. So we'll just wait for a couple of more minutes and then we can start. Okay.
Be good. Thank you, Philip.
Okay, I think maybe we can get started just to make sure we don't run out of time. And people are still joining us, so obviously feel free to join in and tune in at any point during this webinar. So depending on where you're joining us from, because we have panelists from across the globe for this webinar, it's either good morning or good afternoon or good evening. So thank you very much for joining us. My name is Philip de Man. I'm a research manager at the Leuven Centre for Global Governance Studies at the KU Leuven. It's my pleasure to welcome you all and to moderate today's webinar on human rights and development and trade cooperation. So just a couple of quick words about this seminar, about the project that it's a part of, and then I'll be happy to introduce our distinguished panel of speakers. So this session is the first in a series of 4 webinars we have planned that explore HRBA, so human rights-based approaches to EU development cooperation. And today's discussion will, let's say, introduce a couple of core concepts and frameworks and global practices around HRBA in the field specifically of development and trade. And we'll have a chance to reflect on their implications for EU external action as well. And then the 3 subsequent webinars in this series will focus each on a regional perspective from Africa, Asia, and Latin America, which then allows us to kind of build a comparative understanding HRBA principles. So these webinars are organized within the framework of the EU Values Jean Monnet Network, which is a collaboration of 21 higher education institutions spanning 6 continents, involving nearly 100 academic experts. And our network basically seeks to enrich the debate, deepen understanding of values and democracy in the EU's foreign policy, with, of course, part of the project focusing then on human rights as values. And for, let's say, discussion of some of the core concepts concerning this topic, we have with us today, as I've mentioned, a panel of very distinguished speakers. I'm very happy to have with us today Dr. Axel Marx, Professor Kim Taekyoon, and Professor Fabíola Zibetti. First speaker for today is Dr. Axel Marx, who is the Deputy Director of our center here, so of the Leuven Centre for Global Governance Studies. His research focuses on voluntary sustainability standards, EU trade and sustainability policy, and he currently serves as the co-chair of the Academic Advisory Council of the UN Forum on Sustainability Standards. So he will give a presentation on integrating human rights in development cooperation, current practices and challenges. So that presentation will kind of set out or set the scene by outlining how human rights are being mainstreamed in development cooperation, and what challenges this brings for policymakers, practitioners, and so forth. Our second speaker will be Professor Kim Taekyoon of Seoul National University, where he serves as the Vice President for International Affairs, Professional of International Development at the Graduate School of International Studies, and Director of the Asia-Africa Center. Professor Kim's scholarship explores the role of Asia-Pacific Middle Powers in global development governance. This is also the key theme of his presentation, where we'll examine how regional actors navigate and sustain human rights-based norms amid changing geopolitical conditions. Then the third speaker is Professor Fabíola Wüst from the Institute of International Studies at the University of Chile. Professor Zibetti specializes in international trade law, technology, and sustainability, and she coordinates the Chilean research team in the Iberico-American Network of Blockchain and Cybersecurity. So her work basically investigates the intersections between law, innovation, and global governance. So her talk is Enforcing Human Rights in Global Trade, which will then address how international trade regimes can become more responsive to human rights obligations. So each of these 3 speakers will have about 10 to 15 minutes. We're not going to keep time too closely, but ballpark 10 to 15 minutes for their intervention. And after the 3 presentations, we will open the floor for any kind of questions and discussion. So and before we begin, just a couple of more housekeeping notes. So apart from the panelists, all microphones are muted. So if anybody from the audience has any questions or comments, feel very free to post them in the chat at any time. So I will collect the questions and then relay them to the speakers during the Q&A session at the end. Also, if your question is directed at a specific speaker or the panel as a whole, please just indicate that in your question as well. So once again, thank you so much for joining us for this first EU Values webinar. And we look forward to having a thought-provoking discussion on human rights development and trade cooperation. So that being said, please, Axel, feel free to start your presentation and share your screen.
Thank you very much, Philippe, and thank you all for joining. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can. Perfect.
All right, thank you very much. So thank you for the very kind introduction. What I will try to do in 10 minutes is to give a very brief introduction into the topic of human rights and development cooperation policies. I will have a bit of a let's say, more general overview of the developments of the integration of human rights and development cooperation with a focus of the EU, but of course, within the EU, we have different member states which also follow similar approaches. And what I actually want to do is, as way of introduction, is introduce some of the different ways in which human rights have been integrated in development cooperation policies, and show some of the trajectory which has been followed over the last 2-3 decades, highlighting some of, let's say, the main instruments to be used. What I will try to show is that gradually human rights have been more and more integrated in development cooperation policies, mainly within the EU and within different EU member state donor policies. And for each of the ways that's happening, I want to give a very brief introduction, but then also highlight some of the challenges with each of them, which we maybe can also return to in the Q&A. Very briefly, maybe to start off with, is that, let's say before 1990, a lot of things which were happening on the international level with regard to development cooperation and human rights was operating in some of two distinct communities and communities of practice, but gradually they began to grow interest in each other and try to develop mutual exchanges on hand and think about how human rights could be integrated in development cooperation. And following that, development donors have developed several policy strategies for integrating human rights. Now, you can approach that via several different ways. One way is to look at maybe, let's say, 5 approaches which have emerged over time. And these are detailed in a publication, which you'll see here on the slide, Integrating Human Rights into Development, which we actually were involved with as our Center for Global Governance Studies, jointly with the World Bank on developing this overview. And in that document, we highlight, let's say, 5 instruments to which human rights can be integrated in development cooperation policy, and they vary to the degree to which human rights stay a centerpiece of development cooperation policies. I will briefly go in each of them, starting with, let's say, maybe the least far-reaching way of integrating human rights and development cooperation is by just mentioning and promoting democracy and human rights values through different types of development cooperation policies, and recognizing that there's a relationship between human rights and economic development. Now, that's, let's say, a rhetorical endorsement, which does not necessarily indicate a policy in its own regard. And that's, let's say, a first step of recognizing the importance of human rights and development cooperation policies. Second, a bit more next step of integrating human rights and development cooperation policies is making development cooperation projects conditional on respect for human rights. And that can include including human rights considerations when making decisions on budget allocations with regard to certain development cooperation projects. And that has been applied by a number of donors throughout the last couple of years. Some of the challenges which are related to that is that there are actually quite a bit of variation between what is precisely understood under human rights by different donors and how that's included in an assessment of allocating projects. But that's already one, let's say, first step to have a more firm integration of human rights in development cooperation policy. A third one, and which has become quite significant over the last years, well, until recently, I will come back to that in the conclusion, is allocating a significant amount of development cooperation budget and projects to human rights and democracy programs. And that includes developing and supporting local or international human rights organizations and human rights defenders, supporting national human rights institutions and commissions, and a number of donors, and also the EU have had that as their policy, and a significant share of the budget sometimes goes to these types of projects. And that's one important element to support human rights in development cooperation. Some of the issues which were raised with regard to these types of projects and interventions is that there are sometimes what has been called a measurement challenge, in the sense that it's not always difficult to have or assess the impact of these types of interventions and projects, and in a logic of development cooperation where return on investment, added value, and these types of things play an important role. That's an important assessment criteria, and it's something to be taken into account. Now, building on that, these were actually, let's say, more specific types of human rights ways of integrating in development cooperation policies. More recently, we have seen the rise of human rights mainstreaming and a human rights-based approach. And that has been, especially in the last 10, 15 years, a very important shift in focus in development cooperation policy, because here it's not so much having a rhetorical endorsement of human rights or a specific set of projects and programs related to human rights and democracy which are funded and which are set up, but it's trying to integrate a concern and let's say the importance of human rights throughout the entire development cooperation process. Also when it relates to projects in infrastructure development, when it relates to projects in education, when it relates to projects in health. And that's actually trying to mainstream a human rights concern throughout every aspect of development cooperation. And that idea started to grow in the early 2000s within the UN, which actually tried to develop a guidance on integrating human rights throughout the development cooperation cycle. And since then, we have seen a lot of different endorsements, supports of this type of approach, and early donors like SIDA in Sweden and others started to integrate this idea of a human rights-based approach in development cooperation. There's no single policy model and how that should be operationalized, but there are many different ways now out there where they try to integrate a human rights-based approach in development cooperation policy. And in the project, in the book we just mentioned, we try to highlight some of these different approaches to a human rights-based approach. What's common is here that the integration of a human rights-based approach in development cooperation starts from the idea that certain human rights standards, norms, and principles should be streamlined throughout the entire planning, implementation, monitoring of development cooperation programs and projects. And often that means that principles underlying a human rights-based approach include non-discrimination and equality, participation and empowerment, accountability, transparency, and rule of law, in order to make sure that if you set up development cooperation projects, also for instance in infrastructure, that voices of local people are included in the development of these projects, so that it's also clear that there is let's say a voice of the concerned rights holders in the entire process. Throughout the many different examples of a human rights-based approach, you will find a similar approach where a donor would outline some key principles on which to build this policy. And Belgium was one of the adopters in 2023 of a human rights-based approach, and they developed the MEET principles, which is also very closely related to the principles I introduced before, and that refers to meaningful participation, equality, non-discrimination, inclusion of marginalized groups, empowerment and capacity building, transparency and accountability. That means that every project which is set up needs to adhere to these principles. That, of course, this shift to a human rights-based approach has generated quite a bit of debate also, and some challenges, because it really implies a significant rethinking of development cooperation policies. And in an era where, as I mentioned before, there's a focus on added value, impact, measurement, and so on, that's sometimes becoming a difficult issue to highlight what the precise added value of a human rights-based approach is. for delivering on the ground progress with regard to, for instance, education provision, health provision, and so on. And that's a bit a debate between, on the one hand, maybe a more instrumental approach to assessing development cooperation towards a more normative approach. Some authors like Darrow said that these debates are a bit unwarranted and misguided, and that we really need to ensure that a human rights-based approach is a necessary condition to start developing development cooperation projects. Another challenge related to an HRBA is that it really entails a very different way of working for many donors and development cooperation agencies, which means that they have to adapt their programs, that they sometimes need to revise their strategy and organization, and make sure that actually all people involved in different sectors of development cooperation are aware of what an HRBA is and how they can apply that within their specific sectors. And as you know, development cooperation projects are never implemented in isolation. There's a broad range of actors involved, also local stakeholders and other types of actors, which also need to be made aware of this new type of approach and setting up projects, also in terms of evaluating projects and so on. And that's, I think, mostly a process where development cooperation donors need to learn how to apply a human rights-based approach. And that's something which takes time, but which is definitely, I think, a challenge. Now, this, let's say, broad outline of the different ways you can integrate human rights and development cooperation have been very much promoted by the European Union. So as you know, in the European Union, the member states have their development cooperation policies, but of course the EU as such also has their own development cooperation projects and programs, and they've been promoting a human rights-based approach now for over a decade. They also developed actually a very interesting toolbox, which can be used by different types of actors, but mainly donors, on how to apply and more operationalize this human rights-based approach to development cooperation. So in short, there are very different ways to integrate human rights in development cooperation policies, and we can actually distinguish certain generations of actions where there was first a recognition of the added value, and then a more sustained commitment over time via different tools and different ways of integrating human rights in development cooperation. But that story holds very much until 2024. As we now follow the developments in the development cooperation field, especially 2025, the world looks very different. We see a decline in development cooperation budgets. We see a retreat, even by some. So that creates a very different context in which we have to operate. For some, there's even more focus on value for money, on return on investment, especially for countries where there is very difficult budgetary situation. And that's, of course, now creating a different context. And there is a big question, but we can return to that, what the implications are for this human rights-based approach to development cooperation. So that's it for me in my 15 minutes. Thank you very much, and look forward to the questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Axel, for this bird's eye overview of the different, let's say, policy strategies for integrating human rights into development cooperation, highlighting challenges with respect to each one, and indeed closing off with a warning shot that things look indeed a lot different today, and that we need to maybe to rethink our ideas and different policy strategies for integrating human rights as well. So that is maybe a good point to then hand over to our second speaker, Professor Kim. Just maybe before giving him the floor, a reminder to our audience that if you have any questions, do feel free to post them, and we will use them to guide our discussions at the end of our webinar. Okay, please, Professor Kim.
Okay, hold up a second. I'll upload my presentation file first.
Sure.
Okay, everyone can see this?
Yes, perfect.
Right, thank you. Thank you, Philip. So Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, all over the world. So thank you for inviting me to this wonderful the panel. Actually, I prepared this kind of title, Asia Pacific Middle Powers, holding the line in global development governance, because I didn't get any information on today's topic. I mean, human rights-based approach. So my topic is slightly different, kind of cover of ongoing kind of problem in global development governance by looking at the rising importance of Asia Pacific middle powers. So I will start today with what I prepared today. So this presentation explores how middle power such as South Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand are stepping up to sustain rule-based international development order in a period of geopolitical uncertainty. So everyone knows like the Trump effect, and then rise of the China, so U.S.-China rivalry, and so on. So I'll try to touch on slightly by mentioning the Gramsci's interregnum. So this kind of case when the old is dying and the new cannot be born yet. So the U.S.-China rivalry. So we can see many different kind of symptoms about the interregnum right now. So I think that we are living in such a moment, and then the liberal international order, once underpinned by Western democracies, faces multiple, I guess, the crisis, so-called the polycrisis, the rise of authoritarianism and the populist nationalism, and also widening the inequality and then global challenges such as the climate change and the pandemics. So in this vacuum, I guess the Asia Pacific middle powers have begun, emerging as reliable and alternative funders, as well as stabilizer of the global development governance in many aspects. So I will try to explain what kind of the essences we can share in the sense of the rising kind of the importance of the Asia Pacific middle power. So I think that firstly we can touch on the Trump effect. So this year, 2025, marks the return of what I call the Trump effect. So everyone knows under this new reality, global development governance faces major disruptions, such as like the dismantling of USAID and the reduction of over 80% of its project signaled the U.S. retreat from the multilateral aid. And also the aid is no longer framed as a global public good, but rather as a tool of transactional self-interest. I think already the Axel just mentioned a little bit about the self-interest base, like the more investment in infrastructure with the kind of private sector, I think the interest or other kind of natural interest. So the consequences are severe. The fragile state left more vulnerable, and the multilateral institutions lose credibility, and the entire system of development cooperation weakens. So we need to talk about what will be next kind of stage of, post SDG, Sustainable Development Goals, after the 2025, 30. So we need to talk about more the human rights-based approach, and then such as like the disruption in global development governance could be filtered by new kind of frame. One of them should be in the human rights-based approach. And then second point is the China expanding role and the Europe's retreat. So in contrast, China continue to expand its influence. I think that everyone just well known the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, and then Global Development Initiative, in short, the GDI. So China has positioned itself as a major funder, even contributing $500 million to a World Health Organization. However, if you say that Europe, I think the Europe did these efforts raise concerns over debt sustainability and then transparency. I'm talking about the China. So China increasing power and they increase like the investment in through the BRI and GDI. But we can also try to touch on the debt crisis, debt diplomacy. And then meanwhile, the Europe, if you see the Europe case, Europe's attention has turned inward, I guess. So the shrinking aid budget in many European the traditional donors, and the focus on the refugee management and the Ukraine war. So the security budget is now increasing. I mean, instead of the decreasing the ODA budget. So I think as a result, we can witness what could be described as the weakening of the global commons. How about the global South? I think at the same time, the global South is becoming, increasing assertive. So through the platform like BRICS Plus and the SELEC, and then African, the continent free trade area. So I think the developing countries are, promoting certain so-called certain multilateralism and they're calling for reform in global governance. However, these initiatives face limits, such as the regional rivalries and the uneven capacities and the ongoing need for synergy with the traditional, the northern partners as donors. So therefore, while the South voice grows louder, its institutional coherence and power remains still fragile. So I'm going to move on the main topic for my presentation, so Asia-Pacific Middle Powers. So in the fragmented global landscape, I think the Asia-Pacific Middle Powers, already I mentioned the South Korea, Japan, and New Zealand and Australia have a unique role. They all share democratic values and policy credibility and also agility. So in the case of South Korea, once an aid recipient, it now contributes over $5 billion annually in the form of the Official Development Assistance, ODA. And Japan, as one of the founder fathers of the DAC, Development Assistance Committee of the OECD, so it continues to emphasize quality growth and the human security. And then Australia and New Zealand focus on the climate resilience and the regional security in the Pacific. So collectively speaking, these countries serve as probably connectors between the global North and global South, promoting a vision grounded in inclusivity and transparency and democracy, and also the kind of good governance. All right, and then another notable feature of their engagement in multilateralism. So multilateralism means like the small and the flexible coalitions that act faster than large multilateral institutions. So I think the good example of the multilateral is the MICTA. MICTA is kind of group comprising Mexico, Indonesia, South Korea, Turkey, and Australia. So as well as the trilateral dialogues, so they always talk about how to boost up the sustainable development goals through their own kind of project, co-project funded and implemented by the 5 different countries MICTA. So that could be the good case for, I think, the Asia Pacific multilateralism, how they just pursue for their own kind of collaboration. So these frameworks allow for the practical cooperation on issues like climate change and digital infrastructure and also the health security. So for example, South Korea, we always highlight the 2 major transformations, so-called the green transformation and the digital transformation. And then Japan, the other 2 in Asia Pacific, the middle powers share those 2 transformations by using their own ODA. So those ODA could be conceptualized as more democratic and more accountable. Compared to China, compared to the other emerging donors. So that could be, I think, one of the ways how we can just highlight the role of the Asia Pacific middle powers as connector between the global North and global South. And also these small group, the initiatives often scale up into global mechanisms that reinforce the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And also by using Asia Pacific middle powers, they can extend further so-called the aligned-minded countries partnership. So we can invite the Nordic countries from Europe and Canada and Germany. So we can just extend further our kind of the purview of collaboration in the name of the multilateralism in order to hold the line for the good governance and the global development cooperation. However, there are some limits and then constraints to what the middle powers can achieve. I think that domestically, they face ODA fatigue and the rise of nationalism also. All of that, the question, the foreign aid spending at the domestic level. And geopolitically, I have to mention the US-China rivalry pressure. So they're often forced to the balance strategic interests against moral commitments. And also institutionally, the fragmented initiatives risk duplication and also inefficiency. Finally, to overcome these challenges, I think that a shared roadmap and the pooled credibility are urgently needed to strengthen the coherence among those middle power donors. Right. So conclusion. Actually, I just present this paper to the ERD, the European Association of Development Research and then Training Institutes, in the spring. So they already published this short article through the ERD blog. So you can just download if you have interest to hold the script. So they made the argument through this presentation today. Ultimately, the Asia-Pacific middle powers must hold the line, defending the rule-based international development order, even as the great powers turn inward. And this means the pooling resources with like-minded partners, such as Canada and the Nordic countries, and India and South Africa. So India and South Africa also the democracies. We can just define them as maybe the democracies among the global South. So in order to sustain the global cooperation, so their leadership can bridge diverse and reinforce multilateral norms and prevent the fragmentation of global development governance. So as the presentation concludes, I would like to highlight the one key message so that I will read that. Whether the world fragments and endures may depend on whether this middle power sees the moment to lead. So to wrap up, we are witnessing once again interregnum, the US-China rivalry, and then amid the great power rivalry and the institutional retreat, Asia-Pacific middle power could be, good kind of the actors in order to offer the pragmatic and value-based path to sustain global development, governance, and cooperation. Yeah, I'll stop here. Thank you for the listening.
Thanks so much, Professor Kim, for this this very clear outline, I think, of what Axel ended up with in his presentation, which is the changing world order and how this may impact, or how this necessitates maybe a rethinking of the current dynamics and the current policies. And I think the key message you gave at the very end, which is that it's also up to the Asia-Pacific middle powers to make sure that multilateralism, let's say, survives in these challenging times, is also a very important message for the European Union, because the European Union, I think, has traditionally prided itself on being one of, let's say, the flag bearers for this kind of rules-based multilateralism and international order. And I think understanding that there are important, let's say, powers in Asia Pacific that can be crucial partners for the European Union here is a very welcome message, and a very important one, I think, as well. So thank you so much for that. Now the third final speaker for today's session is Professor Fabíola Zibetti. So please, you have the floor.
Hi. So now I hope you can hear me.
Yes, perfect.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, Philip, to invite me for this initiative with Professor Axel and Kim. It's a great pleasure to be here with this audience. I saw some friends and colleagues. It's great to be here to discuss these issues, so important nowadays and so challenging in our world. Well, I propose to debate a bit of human rights related to international trade, especially nowadays that we see some change in the approach about human rights in the trade arena. So let me see. The idea is to discuss a bit of this change, and I would like to start with a bit of historical relationship between human rights and trade. What is not so recent, but we can see in history that the human rights are very close related to trade. And I like to share this example on intellectual property rights. That was the first international treaty on human rights in a period that we was in the 19th century, and the first human rights treaties that we work with this challenge on human rights in the trade arena. And the Paris Convention and for the Berne Conventions will bring some discussion on how manage human rights in the trade space. It's very interesting that obviously we have all the history of human rights in the space different from trade space. And when WTO is created, so these relations between trade and human rights, and particularly the relation of intellectual property, will be ruled in the WTO TRIPS agreement. So it will be very strong, this relation about human rights and trade. And also we have especially in the 1990 decade, this decade of conference and all the new rules on human rights, that more and more will be make pressure on trade. And it's interesting because in general, human rights measures rules was seen as a trade barrier. It's very interesting because it was like this negative relation. They can be together. If I rule human rights, it's like a fair trade barrier, or different manners is like environmental restrictions are acceptable, like an exception to trade rules. And nowadays we see like a change of approach, and in some manner when I was here in Axel, this change of approaches relating to human rights, we see these spreading different issues, in particularly in trade issues. We see nowadays a change for a positive approach, in the sense that the trade measures can promote human rights and reduce inequalities. So we see how these are being changing. First, this idea of trade barriers that is still strong on trade rules, in the sense that when we are ruling human rights, we is limiting or restricting trade. But now we see more and more the impact of trade barriers. So you can see how some manner we can rule free trade, like a fair trade, in the sense that trade can bring more development, and seeing that economic pressures, trade barriers can impact and prejudice the human rights. So nowadays we see that the new approach, new rules, and new manner to rule trade, in a sense, to use the trade measures to promote human rights and reduce inequalities, and is much more acceptable than we see historically. So it's very interesting how these trade measures are working on change the idea of trade and generate more benefits to human rights through trade measures that not generate impact on human rights, especially using the trade as a manner to improve living standards, to avoid human rights violations. So these ongoing measures to ensure that trade measures can promote human rights, reduce inequality, are being object of discussion, and particularly when we see the international arena where these issues are being discussed, we can see these being regulated through international frameworks and agreements. So we have the trade rules and the human rights rules in different spaces, different documents, and nowadays we see how these are more close connected. So the human rights conventions, we can see many of them, not only conventions, for instance, from the International Labour Organization, but also other human rights conventions being incorporated in trade agreements. And an example was the WTO TRIPS agreement that brings from that WTO agreements this idea of human rights related to trade. But we see nowadays not only this kind of these provisions, but also many of FTA agreements with provision and chapters that work on human rights issues, not only labor, sustainable development, gender issues, and other issues that are being ruled. So also we have another documents, not so binding agreements, but some good practices and normative, not so binding, like UN Guide Principles on Business and Human Rights and other provisions that try to rule and make this framework more friendly, in the sense for a more positive approach of human rights and trade. So we have it's very interesting here listening Professor Kim about this discussion about the international system, the role of Asia Pacific, and the great discussions on multilateralism, that nowadays we have new issues, new approach, and many of these approaches is building by multilateral rules in some manner. We have the international system more dedicated by one side for human rights mechanism and rules, and the other side we have all with is the World Trade Organization and the multilateral system that rules trade, but they don't have a very strong communication. We see that this is evolving in the last years. We see some work on WTO related to human rights. That's an ongoing debates. More in multilateral arena, like a plurilateral initiatives, but we still don't have a systematic transformation, and said Axel, that could be multilateral and could converge this discussion. So we have initiatives ongoing. We have changes on this approach and perception of the relation of trade and human rights. But we need to work more on this, in a sense to build a fair trade with clear and rules that could be in a sense of use international trade policies and rules to safeguard, to foster economic growth, human rights protection. So we have nowadays started to have some new standards, but we know that this is a challenging issue until we don't have a solution for at the moment. So this work on balancing growth and rights and use the framework of trade to foster human rights is something that is very important nowadays. So I don't want to exceed my time, just to mention that it's very important to work on global collaboration, foster this discussion in unilateral arenas, because we know that it's so complex, this geopolitical situation, this challenge that we have nowadays. So this discussion must be put on the table. I think this discussion on review the international system and to find a new solution on how organize. We have a different a system, very disciplinary, very segmented, fragmented. So it's more than necessary try to converge these complex issues, make solutions that could balance human rights and international trade in a sense to face this complex challenge. Yeah, obviously, it's very important to put as important issue to be think is human dignity, the sustainability goals. We know that nowadays the digital transformation comes strongly, and this is more than urgent to find the solutions through global cooperation. So it's just a message in the sense that these fragmented initiatives could be very important, and in a sense to make a strengthness to think this in a multilateral new world system. So just to be fast and to not exceed my time, I give the floor Professor Philip. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Fabíola, for this closing talk on, a lot of, let's say, parallels, obviously, with the first presentation, and framed in, let's say, the changing landscape of the second presentation as well. So a lot of, let's say, parallels in the difficulties and challenges in trying to integrate human rights into both trade policies and development cooperation policies as well. So we have about 10 minutes time for a discussion. So maybe I'll just take some of the questions and just to maybe ask the same question more or less to everybody in the panel, something of an overarching question that kind of connects all of them. I would think could be we've heard obviously from Professor Kim that the current global landscape is marked by what he calls an interregnum, right? A weakening, I guess, of traditional multilateral institutions and the rise of let's say transactional aid logics and an increasing fragmentation also between North and South. So against that background, maybe we can ask all the three speakers, what do you think this changing multilateral order means for the relationship between human rights development and trade? And do you think that frameworks like the human rights-based approach or human rights clauses in trade agreements, if those kinds of frameworks can still really function as let's say, credible global standards, or is it really much more, let's say, fundamental than that? Do we really need to rethink how human rights can be advanced in this, let's say, more fragmented world? Maybe we can take the same order, if that's okay, as the speaker. So maybe I'll ask Axel first for some of his thoughts on this.
Thank you very much, Philip. And it's very pertinent question, and my take is a bit maybe a bleak one in the sense that looking at development cooperation policies, there's a clear hollowing out of current approaches, not only financially, but also in approach. So I think there might be some very, or should I say, significant changes in how development cooperation policies will evolve over time. Now, with regard to trade, I'm also not very optimistic. You already heard from Fabíola some of the approaches, but also there, in a fragmented world, we will see an increase maybe in the necessity of middle powers and also other powers to collaborate with one another and foster trade agreements. And I think that will happen, or that might happen. But the question to what degree human rights and other sustainability concerns will still be playing a role there, that's something else. I know the EU has been promoting very much this approach. That's not always been welcomed by other parties. And these other parties now also see that, well, the EU needs to develop certain types of agreements, and they might actually become less strict on some of the human rights requirements in there. Let's wait and see. But that might be one of the consequences of this fragmentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Axel. Maybe I'll give the floor now to Professor Kim for his take on the question.
All right, thank you very much indeed. Very good question. I don't have the good answer to your question, but the couple of the comments I'm going to share. Firstly, democracy and human rights, in my understanding, it should be homegrown. So first of all, we can just universalize some core essence of human rights to Global South and Global North. All together. Probably Global South have the different idea. What is the human rights? What is democracy? So we need to develop some kind of the common ground about what is the real kind of the concept of human rights, in order to make that and use that as cross-cutting kind of agenda for every single different development sector. I think maybe 17 different goals of SDGs, or more than that. They're up to the 2030. So firstly, reconceptualizing the human rights. That could be one of, I think, the good kind of trial to figure it out. It could be working for, I think, the kind of common goods. And secondly, HDP nexus, humanitarian development and peace nexus. So human rights not working, as it is. Probably it should be integrated or connected to some other kind of sector and the issues. Maybe the peace or peace building or the humanitarianism or development. So once again, human rights like the core essence of the cross-cutting. So we can develop cross-cutting. What kind of cross-cutting? What kind of role function as cross-cutting? When it comes to the human rights as the real kind of backbone for the sustainable development. And then finally, WTO is not working. It's almost dying, I guess, right? So the free trade agreements, they're always a violation of the WTO policies. And also, if you see that Trump kind of the war, tariff, it's another the major barrier for the free trade and then other types of the trade. Even if we want to include the human rights as one of the key kind of the policy or the principle for trading system. So how we can just normalize or bring the WTO back to the core discussion table. So not only in the WTO but also at the UN system as well. So we need something else to do something kind of for the revitalizing the multilateral organizations. That's why I'm trying to say, middle power or the multilateralism could be, I think, used as a good kind of driving force to the collecting all different, the voices into the core table, how to revitalize the multilateral organization. Yeah, that's my thoughts.
Thank you very much. Very pertinent observations, and revitalizing the multilateral organizations is quite a big ask, but I agree that it's, let's say, crucial to resolving the issues we have now. So finally, Professor Zibetti, please.
Thank you, Philip. And I do agree with Kim, and also in some manner with Axel. We need to think in how revitalize these multilateral organizations that are fragmented. Economic issues in the place, human rights in the other. These issues are close connected. How to manage the new world order is very complex. So, and as Kim mentioned, each country, each region have a different manner to see human rights, to see how trade could be managed. And it's very challenging. And in this manner, when we see these multilateralism initiatives, is and also FTAs and other regional agreements, we can see that there are some common issues that are put in a base that is the agreement, and it can establish some standards that are converging in terms of what we can prioritize on human rights related to trade. So I think these initiatives, I think we have the multilateral system in the process of transition, and these fragmented initiatives, until can be fragmented, I think they can converge for a new standard in the multilateral space. I think it's not a fast, it's not easy, because I think not all the initiatives are converging, but I think we have now new levels, new standards that could be helpful on this work. I think it's very challenging issue, but I think it's the key issue for our future in common on Earth. And well, I hope we can work hard in this, and in a sense that we can generate a new world war that can manage and balance what means international trade, a fair trade, and considered human rights. But I have not the solution. So I think this space like this, Philip, thank you very much, is very important to put this in discussion.
Yes, thank you so much. We are around the closing time of our seminar, but I wanted to give the opportunity maybe just for one more audience member to ask a question. So also I mean, it's always really, let's say, very challenging, because we think of this in absolute terms, and we try to think of the whole and all the challenges that are there. But I think the audience member here asks a question that might, let's say, take a little bit more of a different approach. So it's a question that is specifically directed towards Professor Kim. And they mentioned, the idea of middle powers and multilateral groups is very interesting. You mentioned the main focus of the countries like South Korea might be on green and digital transformation at the moment. The question is, how do you see their potential in projecting human rights in the global arena? And if there's any hint that has been shown, or that has shown the potential of these middle powers. And I think, if maybe I'm paraphrasing, but the idea for me here is, rather than looking at all these abstract challenges, maybe there is a specific example where we can look at, okay, this is where South Korea, for example, or other Asian middle powers have actually, in a very specific issue area like the digital transformation or green transition, have shown their potential to actually, let's say, reintegrate the multilateral order.
Okay, very shortly, very question indeed. Really appreciate. I just mentioned what are Asia Pacific middle powers. I just mentioned 4 countries: South Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. Why? They all share the democratic system and the core value of democracy, and then liberal market, and also human rights. So that could be a starting point. So we can just make some kind of the gathering among the 4 countries, and then we can invite another kind of partner from the Europe, Nordic, and Belgium, and other countries, and also from the North America to Canada, and also from the Global South, India, South Africa. I only to mention 2 countries from the Global South, especially in the case of the BRICS. So India and South Africa, we can see there's some kind of common element of democracies or human rights to some degree. So we can expand our kind of the group in the name of multilateralism in order to do the digital transformation, green transformation. So I think firstly, we have to share the common or the core essence of democracy and human rights. And then we can just invite the more partner, like-minded countries in the name of multilateralism. So I think that one of the solutions we can just begin from the Asia Pacific, and then of course you can start from the Europe, you can start from Latin America. So we can make all the core kind of the voices from the different kind of multilateralism, and then we can just put them all together to the multilateral organization for reforming. So maybe post 2030. or the post-SDG, we have to collect all the like-minded voices from the unilateral kind of gathering at the different regions. So it could be, I think, many topics we can deal with, like the digital or green, how to include the human rights and the democratic kind of the essences. So that's my the general kind of idea, but I don't know, it's not a good answer to the question. Sorry for that.
I think it's a great question, a great answer to a great question. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. So thanks so much to our three speakers, Dr. Marx, Professor Kim, Professor Fabíola, for their very thoughtful, engaging contributions. Thank you very much, everybody in the audience, for tuning in, for your excellent questions. So today's discussion, I think, with all the diverse perspectives presented, I think really set the stage for the next steps in our webinar series on human rights-based approaches in this EU Values webinar series. So we invite you to join us again next week, the 21st of October, for a session focusing on Asian perspectives in human rights-based approaches. And then the next plan, I think, is on the 27th of October, which is then more focusing on the African perspective in this entire discussion. So again, on behalf of the EU Values Network and the Leuven Centre for Global Governance Studies, thank you so much for being with us today. And we look forward to continuing the conversation in the coming weeks. So have a very good day or a very good evening, again, depending on where you're coming from. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.